Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering my pick for the best Death Cleric in Baldur's Gate 3. This damage-focused cleric adds huge burst damage and a great early game to Cleric's already extremely powerful arsenal, and also comes with a massive endgame power spike. So it turns the already extremely reliable cleric into an even more smooth experience throughout an honor mode run, with no weak points at any level during the build. This character adds enormous amounts of burst damage, so you can one-shot single enemies, and brings all of the control that Cleric normally brings, making Domain Cleric an excellent choice for any honor mode party. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Tarantula for the $5 donation, Dalton Jenkins for the $5, and Potato 2.0, Alito123able, and Burley for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support. Alright, let's get building. We're using Shadowheart as the example character here, because of course this is a cleric build, and she's the cleric of the party, but what's more, Death Domain is one of Shar's two canonical domains. Those are Death and Trickery, so this is actually one of the most lore-friendly possible ways to build Shadowheart. Especially true if, like me, you find the way they implemented Trickery Domain in Baldur's Gate 3 to be pretty underwhelming. You can still build Shadowheart in an extremely lore-friendly way and end up with a much stronger character overall using Death Domain. If you're building this as a custom character, what race we pick mostly doesn't matter. We get all of the weapon and armor proficiencies that we need from the class, so we don't need to get those from our race. But some great options from a mechanical standpoint include Halfling, because the ability to reroll ones is excellent for any character that wants to maintain concentration on spells, and just any character overall, just a very powerful racial feature. Wood Elf or Half Wood Elf for the bonus movement speed. As a cleric, one of our main goals is going to be hitting as many enemies as possible with Spirit Guardians, and Death Domain clerics will operate in melee a little more than other clerics, so extra movement speed is even better for us. Githyanki is for the once per day Misty Step, gives us a great panic button, or lets us get at enemies that we wouldn't otherwise be able to. Without that Misty Step from the race, you'll probably invest a piece of gear in learning Misty Step, so that can save you a gear slot. And Dwergar for out of combat invisibility is just always incredibly powerful, so those are some great options if you're looking to optimize even further. But again, mostly you can pick whatever you want, and you'll still end up with an extremely powerful character. For this guide, we'll be focusing on a monoclass cleric, so we're going to start with a level of cleric, but I should mention that if you want to multiclass, most of the good multiclasses for this character want to be taken at level 1. Starting with a little level of fighter can get you heavy armor proficiency, constitution save proficiency, and the defense fighting style, making you a lot tankier. And starting with 2 levels of paladin can get you smites, which make you a much more powerful melee combatant. For a little more on this, you can check out my guide to the Dark Justiciar, which I posted a couple weeks ago. 1 level of Sorcerer also gets you con save proficiency and the shield spell, and a level of Wizard can let you scribe all of the wizard spells, so those are all great options to start with, but for a monoclass cleric, of course we're going to start with a level of cleric. For our domain, we are taking Death Domain Cleric, and this gives us a couple things right away. Firstly, it gives us the Reaper passive, allowing us to target with our Necromancy cantrips multiple creatures. We can, if they normally would target 1 creature, we can target 2 creatures. Now, during the stress test, this let you double target the same creature, but it no longer does. This has to be targeted at 2 different creatures, but this is still doubling the damage output of your cleric at early levels when you're casting a cantrip. There are very few fights where there are not multiple enemies that you can target with Reaper, and doing 2d8 damage with a Bone Chill or 2d12 damage with a Toll the Dead is really good damage output, especially for a spellcaster in the early game. This makes Death Domain Cleric one of the strongest early game characters for the first 3 levels or so, because the amount of damage that you do in the early game, while also being very tanky thanks to your armor proficiencies and bringing all of the utility of cleric spellcasting, is extremely high. So you will be able to make any early game honor mode run significantly smoother thanks to the Reaper passive. This also stays extremely relevant on into the late game, because double casting Bone Chill to stop 2 enemies from healing or give disadvantage on attacks to 2 undead is very, very powerful. I'll talk a little bit more about that under the cantrip section, but this ability is one of the major draws of Death Domain Cleric, and is extremely powerful in the early game and remains very powerful throughout the game. We also get a bonus cantrip. We choose one of 3, and we get 2 spells, domain spells. These are False Life and Ray of Sickness. Now, unfortunately, these are quite weak domain spells, so typically you're not going to want to use spell slots on either of these. Death Domain Cleric does have a relatively subpar domain spell list, though there's some standouts that we'll talk about when we get there, but the class features more than make up for it. For our cantrip selection, we actually have 2 different ways to choose cantrips for this character. Death Domain gets a bonus cantrip, and you can choose one of these 3, Bursting Sinew, Toll the Dead, or Bone Chill. Now, of these 3, Bursting Sinew and Toll the Dead are already available to every cleric, but Bone Chill is only available to Death Domain clerics. That means that for this cantrip, this is the one that we're always going to want to pick, because Bone Chill is a very powerful cantrip in the early game, and remains a very relevant cantrip throughout the game. This is an attack roll-based cantrip instead of a saving throw-based cantrip, so against a lot of enemies it's going to be easier to land. It has 60-foot range and does a d8 of damage, so it's just great damage overall. So we can double it and hit 2 enemies with it, and it prevents enemies from healing for a turn, which, again, in the early game is very relevant. There's a lot of enemies that have some healing that preventing them from using can make your combat significantly smoother. In the mid-game especially, where there's a lot of undead, giving 2 enemies disadvantage on attack rolls with no saving throw, you just have to hit them with the spell, is very powerful. So Bone Chill is an amazing utility cantrip, and awesome that clerics get access to it through Death Domain Cleric, something that you normally wouldn't get. For our remaining 3 cantrips, we're going to take Toll the Dead, which is Cleric's best combat cantrip. This is a saving throw-based cantrip, but it targets Wisdom, and a lot of early game enemies have pretty poor Wisdom saves, so they will usually fail on this, and does a d8 of damage. So sometimes this will be more damage than more accurate than Bone Chill. Sometimes Bone Chill will be more accurate, depending on whether enemies have better armor class or Wisdom saves. However, if an enemy is damaged, it does a d12 of damage. 2 d12 of damage in the early game, because remember, we're doubling all our cantrips, is really quite excellent. That's a lot of damage. So this, again, makes our early game much, much smoother. Our remaining cantrips, of course, we're going to take Guidance, because Guidance is pretty much mandatory for every party, just the best spell in Baldur's Gate 3. And then for our last one, we have a lot of different options. There's many things that we could take that would be pretty relevant here. Since we have 2 combat cantrips, we don't really need Produce Flame, which is the normal combat cantrip you would have taken before Toll the Dead and Bone Chill were available. We could take Blade Ward to make ourselves a little bit tankier, but I'm just going to suggest taking Bursting Sinew. You can double cast this on multiple corpses, and 2d10 of AoE damage for a cantrip is actually pretty nice in the early game. Also, it's just fun and very thematic for Death Domain Clerics. Your last cantrip pick here is going to be somewhat situational anyways, so might as well make it situationally awesome. Finally, for our ability score selections, as a cleric, we only really need Wisdom and Dexterity and Constitution, which every character needs, so that lets us get away with the greediest possible attribute split. We're going to take 17 Wisdom, 16 Dexterity, and 15 Constitution, and then we'll even out these odd numbers with our first ability score improvement. If you really care about having 12 strength or whatever, you can take 16, 14, 16, and then 12 strength, and then respec to this split later on. But just for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to show you this attribute split right away. This is the highest we can get 3 single attributes, and since we only care about 3 attributes, it means that we get a little bit of a bonus because we're playing a single attribute dependent or sad character. Being sad, in this case, being very good. Works for Shadowheart as well. For our skill selection, there's pretty much no skills that we need to take at this point. If you get Perception from Racial Proficiency, because Wood Elves get it, then that's relevant, but clerics mostly will not be making skill checks throughout Baldur's Gate 3, because they're not going to be your party face, so they won't be doing a lot of dialogue skills, so you can pick kind of whatever you want here for flavor. That's all the decisions we have to make at level 1. Let's move on to level 2. At character level 2, we get an additional Death Cleric ability, Channel Divinity, Touch of Death. So how this works is when you hit a creature with a melee attack, you can spend your channel divinity. We have one per short rest at this level, but we'll get a second at level 6, to deal extra necrotic damage. Now this necrotic damage is equal to double your cleric level plus 5. So at this level it's 9, and at maximum level, when we're level 12, it'll be 29 bonus damage. It goes up by 2 every level. 9 bonus damage on a melee attack is notable in that it is the same average damage as a Paladin Smite. So we basically get a short rest Paladin Smite that we can cast whenever we hit an enemy with a melee attack. Now, one thing you're probably noticing about this build is we have 16 dex, so we can attack with finesse weapons, but 8 strength, so we're not attacking with melee weapons that frequently. However, this is any melee attack. It does not have to be a melee weapon attack. So if we hit an enemy with a melee spell cast, like for example, Inflict Wounds, then we get to add 9 bonus damage on top of Inflict Wounds. Inflict Wounds does 3d10 damage, which is 16.5 average damage. So adding in Channel Divinity Touch of Death increases that 16.5 average damage up to 25.5 average damage. That's more than enough to one-shot most enemies at this level, and remains relevant damage throughout the early game. So don't underestimate how much burst damage you can do by combining an Inflict Wounds and a Channel Divinity. That means that for our prepared spell list, we're definitely going to include Inflict Wounds, because Death Domain Cleric is so good at dealing extra burst damage, and since we have a melee spell, we can use our Channel Divinity to inflict even more damage with it. In addition to that, of course, for our prepared spell list, we're going to take the normally powerful spells for Cleric. We're going to grab Healing Word for bonus action healing, of course. Command, the best control spell in the game. Sanctuary, because of this gives you so much extra safety in Honor Mode especially, but also you can do really cool tricks with it, like causing enemies to group up around your character before dropping an AoE on a bunch of grouped enemies and stuff like that. And Bless, which just makes the whole party significantly more consistent. So this spell list gives you burst damage from Inflict Wounds and a ton of utility and protection and control in order to win combats normally, while you're also passing out twice as much damage with just your default combat actions because of Reaper doubling the damage from your cantrips. At character level 3, we get access to second level spells, and Death Domain gives us 2 new domain spells. These domain spells are Blindness, which is actually really not bad to have as a domain spell. This isn't a spell you would normally prepare because it's quite situational, but when you have it prepared for free, it's a pretty powerful debuff. A 10-turn long debuff that gives enemies disadvantage and you advantage on attacks against them is really good for any fight that's going to go longer. And although this is a constitution save, which enemies typically have pretty good values in, there are a lot of ways to reduce enemy con saves and make this land more reliably. These include things like reverberation stacks, which give them a stacking penalty to their constitution saves, and causing enemies to bleed, which gives them disadvantage on con saves, and it's pretty easy to do without a saving throw in the early game, using the bleeding grenades and stuff. So you can reliably land blindness on powerful bosses, which makes those fights significantly easier. Not one that you would normally prepare as a cleric, but when you get it for free, it's great. On the other hand, Ray of Enfeeblement is not a spell that I would normally suggest casting. This debuff just isn't strong enough, and there are better control options for your level 2 spell slot, so Blindness is a situationally useful spell here, but Ray of Enfeeblement, not a significant contributor to your character. For our level 2 spell preparation, though, we can also add in Spiritual Weapon. You can sometimes take Hold Person, which is a better control spell, but Blindness does a pretty good Hold Person approximation in the early game, and then also does not require your spell preparation slot, so leaves the slots open for more powerful options. Spiritual Weapon is great because it takes a bonus action and no concentration, and enemies will spend attacks on it. You can use it to block doorways and stuff. Just a very useful utility spell to have overall. At character level 4, we get to take our first feat, and we actually have kind of an interesting choice here. We can either take an ability score improvement to boost our wisdom and constitution, fix these odd numbers, get more hit points and better ability to concentrate on spells, as well as higher save DCs and accuracy with our own spells. Or, of course, as always is an option in Honor Mode, we can take Alert. if you take the ASI, you get kind of double the value of a normal ASI, because you're boosting 2 attributes, each by +1, 2 attribute modifiers, each by +1, so you get more improvement than most characters who are taking ASIs do. But of course, Alert is always excellent for Honor Mode. If you take the ability score improvement, then I highly recommend dedicating a piece of initiative gear to this character. +3 initiative is fine for Act 1, but you're definitely going to start feeling the pinch when you get to late Act 1 and into Act 2 before you can take Alert at level 8 if you go with the ASI. So you'll want to rectify the lower initiative that the character will have by taking some kind of initiative gear. For the smoothest ride through Honor Mode, I would nevertheless just recommend taking Alert. Having +8 initiative means you'll pretty much always go first in the first 2 acts, and the importance of that cannot be overstated, especially for a control-focused spellcaster like Cleric. And for Death Domain, it's even better because our high burst damage will let us just kill some enemies before they can ever act. So Alert is my pick, but the ASI is definitely a reasonable option if you don't need the initiative gear for another character and just hate seeing these odd numbers. For our cantrip selection, at this level, we're going to take Blade Ward. While this isn't a spell that I would normally recommend casting all the time, Blade Ward is a great situational spell for when your character, which is often forward and positioned near enemies, gets caught out and surrounded by multiple enemies. This can buy you a turn for an ally to do something about that, or just act as a reasonable panic button. You can also precast it before combat starts, because it does last for 2 turns, so if you don't have another pre-combat buff that you want to spend your first turn before combat on, then Blade Ward does give you a little bit of extra value early on. So this is just a pretty useful situational spell. Another option is Resistance. There's some story events that want you to have higher saving throws that you can prep for by taking Resistance. So whether you want to succeed more easily on dialogue, in dialogue saving throws, Resistance is good, or if you want a better combat option, Blade Ward is good. Either of those make excellent choices. At character level 5, we get access to 3rd level spells, and this is where Death Domain Cleric actually gets some pretty nice spells as domain spells, or one nice spell. Animate Dead is a very relevant spell throughout the game. Anything that creates summons is automatically going to be quite powerful, so picking up Animate Dead definitely gives us some great options. This can scale and allow you to summon multiple creatures with a 4th level spell slot, or more powerful creatures with 5th and 6th level spell slots. Generally speaking, a 4th level spell slot for 3 skeletons is what I would recommend, though the zombies can be good to absorb a bunch of damage as well, and especially if you can get them to trigger spawning more zombies. But anything that gives you more bodies on the field lets you control the battlefield and dictate fights on your terms, so Animate Dead is just a great spell to have as a domain spell. Vampiric Touch is another melee spell that you can use, but generally speaking, this is just much worse than upcasting Inflict Wounds. Regaining the hit points is usually not going to be as relevant as just doing more damage, so typically you're not going to be casting Vampiric Touch. For our prepared spells at this level, we're going to add in 2 more spells to our spell list, and those are Glyph of Warding, which is your best non-concentration combat spell, an AoE spell that's extremely versatile. It can be crowd control or damage, or both, if you use the ice spell to both do, the ice version to both do damage and create an ice surface. And of course, like every cleric, we're going to take Spirit Guardians. Now, Spirit Guardians for a Death Domain cleric is even better, because we get to use the secret 2nd version of Spirit Guardians, where we do necrotic damage with it, because at next level, we're going to get the ability to ignore enemy resistances to necrotic damage. So for enemies that we don't want to do radiant damage against, for whatever reason, the necrotic damage version of Spirit Guardians is still excellent for Death Domain clerics. Of course, we also still have the radiant damage version, which can be used naturally to trigger radiating orbs and do all of the things that clerics can do most powerfully as well. So that gives us a great option also. We will, at this point, be able to drop Bless as well, because we probably will be concentrating on Spirit Guardians most of the time. And if you're using the gear that gives you Bless when you heal an ally, being able to mass apply that with Mass Healing Word as a bonus action is incredibly helpful, so I recommend swapping out Bless for Mass Healing Word, and then you'll get Bless by casting healing spells or throwing potions at allies in order to apply those buff on heal item effects. At character level 6, we get access to the aforementioned ability, Inescapable Destruction, which makes our spells ignore resistance to necrotic damage. There's a lot of enemies in Baldur's Gate 3 who have necrotic resistance, which is part of why these types of necromancy spells that deal necrotic damage are often not the spells that people suggest taking, and that I suggest taking. But Death Domain Cleric gets to ignore all of these resistances and just deal damage through them. This is pretty powerful, so enables you to use a lot of other strategies, like the necrotic version of Spirit Guardians, that are not really accessible to other characters. Secondly, we also get an additional Channel Divinity charge. This gives us 2 per short rest for 6 total, and that's before you even consider additional short rests from a bard, for example, in your party. And each of those Channel Divinity charges, if used for Touch of Death, deals double our cleric level plus 5, or 17 total damage. 6 times 17 is 102, which means we have access to 102 extra damage over the course of the day. Adding 17 damage to a cast of Inflict Wounds is often enough to finish off an enemy who even has most of their health remaining. Usually won't one-shot them at this level, but you can often burst down a pretty dangerous enemy using those abilities. So while you won't use this in every fight, the extra burst damage that you get and the amount of additional damage that you can do over the course of an adventuring day means that you provide really solid, consistent damage to every single encounter that you're in. Any enemy that's weak, you can run up to in melee, hit them with an Inflict Wounds, and then burst them down. You can also chip away at enemy HP using double casting cantrips, which are still going to be a pretty powerful source of additional damage. So Death Domain Cleric just contributes excellent damage, while also continuing to get all the stuff that makes other clerics so good. At level 7, we get access to 4th level spells, including 2 new domain spells from Death Domain Cleric. Death Ward is one of these, and generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend using a spell slot on Death Ward. There are some bugs you can abuse to make your characters completely invincible with this spell, but other than that, it's just very unreliable. Enemies that do multiple damage instances in one attack will often kill you through it, and it's just not worth spending a 4th level spell slot on. Blight, on the other hand, is not normally available to clerics, and is a pretty nice spell to have. It's just a big chunk of burst damage that, because we're Death Domain Cleric, ignores necrotic damage resistance, and then also synergizes extremely well with one of the best pieces of equipment for us, the Staff of Cherished Necromancy, to let us cast Blight spells without spending a spell slot for free over and over again. For our prepared spells at this level, we're going to make a couple changes, but we're going to go back and grab Hold Person. Hold Person is still an extremely nice control spell, and it's especially synergistic for Death Domain Clerics because we often want to cast Inflict Wounds. Since Hold Person gives automatic critical hits on attacks from within 10 feet, and Inflict Wounds is an attack roll, and has to be done in melee, so we're always within 10 feet, an option that we now have is to hit an enemy with Hold Person, and then drink a speed potion, and then hit them with an Inflict Wounds, which is an automatic critical. Doubling the damage on 3d10 or more if we're spending higher level spell slots. We have up to 4th level spell slots, so this could be up to a 6d10 times 2 Inflict Wounds, and then add 17 damage on top of that, or actually at this level 19 damage on top of that. That is a huge amount of burst damage that we have available if we're willing to spend a speed potion or a haste on it in order to get the extra action. We're also going to be grabbing Guardian of Faith. This is a great combat spell in these middle levels, because the 60 hit points that the Guardian has will absorb a lot of damage from enemies, and because it's so large and immovable, you can put it in a doorway, and enemies will not be able to get through that doorway without taking the damage from it, or without attacking it. So it gives you a lot of additional agency and control over the battlefield. At character level 8, we get our second feat, and the feat that we're going to take is whichever of an ASI or alert we didn't take at level 4. For my recommended leveling order, we're going to take the ability improvement here, but if you took this at level 4, then you'll just grab alert, because you definitely want both of these by level 8. This increases our constitution to 16 and gives us 67 hit points, which is really not bad considering that we also have medium armor and shield proficiency, so we're relatively tanky at this point, and of course increases our wisdom as well. We also, because we're a Death Domain Cleric, get Divine Strike Necrotic, which lets us once per turn add a d8 of necrotic damage to a weapon attack. This is not super useful for this character because we typically won't be making weapon attacks, and you can't, unlike our Channel Divinity, you cannot add Divine Strike to a spell cast, so you can't use it with Inflict Wounds. But one option that you do have if you want to use this ability is to drink an Elixir of Hill or Cloud Giant Strength and just be able to make weapon attacks and use Divine Strike. That can give you something to do in a turn where you want to use a Channel Divinity, because of course you can use that with weapon attacks as well as spells, but don't want to spend a spell slot on Inflict Wounds. So if you drink an Elixir, you can hit an enemy using Divine Strike and then add your Channel Divinity to that damage, which allows you to make use of Divine Strike. But most Death Domain Clerics are just not going to be paying too much attention to this ability. At character level 9, we get access to 5th level Cleric spells and 2 more spells from Death Domain Cleric. The first of these is Contagion, which is generally speaking not worth spending a spell slot on, but does have one interesting use case, which is that casting it outside of combat doesn't count as a hostile action. So if you know you're going to start a fight with a currently neutral enemy, you can hit them with a Contagion before the fight starts and get them with a very powerful debuff before initiating combat. Generally still not worth a 5th level spell slot, but for certain fights that you know are going to start or that you want to start specifically, Contagion does have some situational uses. The real winner here, though, is Cloud Kill, which is actually a quite nice spell to have just always prepared. It won't be useful in every combat, but any situation where enemies are sort of unable to move out of the Cloud Kill, this is a lot of damage. It doesn't look like that much because it's only 5d8, but the 5d8 damage from Cloud Kill happens both when you first cast it and at the beginning of creatures' turns when they're inside the Cloud Kill. So you basically get 10d8 poison damage. There's also a lot of ways to become immune to poison damage, so you can fight in your own Cloud Kills, including with Hero's Feast, which we'll get as a 6th level Cleric spell as a Death Domain Cleric. So you can spend your spell slot on Hero's Feast and then fight inside your own Cloud Kills where you're safe from the poison damage, and enemies will have to take the poison damage in order to engage you. So there's a lot of interesting things that you can do with Cloud Kill. It won't come up in every fight, but it's a pretty powerful tool to have in our arsenal. For our prepared spells at this level, we're going to go ahead and pick up from 5th level just Flame Strike, which is just a nice burst damage spell. This, again, is relatively situational, but will come up in some encounters, and then we're going to grab Banishment. Banishment is very good in specific encounters because it targets an enemy's charisma save. So while this is overall a weaker crowd control effect than most other crowd control spells, it will often be much more reliable because there's a lot of enemies in the game that have truly terrible charisma saves, so Banishment can be landed on those enemies quite reliably. We can also grab something like Aid. You can cast Aid from a camp caster, but if you're not using camp casters, then spending like a 4th level spell slot on giving all of your allies a ton of additional hit points for the entire long rest is a very efficient use of your spell slot, so Aid is very good. Aid is also the only way that you can heal the Guardian of Faith, which is actually a pretty interesting use of this spell as well, in order to boost the Guardian of Faith's HP, get more damage out of it, and cause enemies to have to take more swings at it in order to bring it down. At character level 10, we get Divine Intervention, which of course is a once per game quite powerful ability. Typically you're going to want to use this to summon the weapon because the weapon has a lot of utility depending on what you're doing with your party. If you're still using the buff on heal items, then the Devotee's Mace is actually just a really nice healing item because it triggers all of those abilities. It gives you constant healing over time while you're running around with your Spirit Guardians or whatever active. We also get an additional cantrip, and since we can't take True Strike to annoy people in the YouTube comments, I'm going to suggest taking Sacred Flame so that Shadowheart has something to miss with in the late game so that she doesn't feel unappreciated for her contributions earlier on. At character level 11, we get access to 6th level spells. And while there are no domain spells for Death Domain Clerics, 6th level spells are obviously the most powerful things that spellcasters get access to. So, of course, this is an amazing level for us where we get another massive power spike. For our 6th level spell, there are basically 2 options for day-long buffs and 1 option for use in combat. The day-long buffs, you're choosing between spending your 6th level spell slot on Hero's Feast and Planar Ally, or of course you can do both if you have a way to refresh your 6th level spells, like one of the items that does that. Hero's Feast is typically going to be my go-to suggestion. Not only is it just a very good buff for your entire party all day, immunity to frightened and advantage on wisdom saves just makes you so much more effective in combat, and the increase to HP is very nice as well. It's especially synergistic with Death Domain Clerics because, as previously mentioned, it makes you immune to poison so you can stand in your own cloud kills and not take damage from them. The other option is to use Planar Ally, and you can summon the Jinni or the Deva. Don't summon the Cambion, it's much worse than the other two, in order to just have another very powerful summon available. The Planar Ally is typically much better than Create Undead, so although Create Undead might seem more thematic, you definitely would prefer the Planar Ally over the Create Undead. Harm is not worth preparing, even though it's a necrotic damage effect, because it can't kill enemies. Spending a level 6 spell slot on not killing something is just embarrassing, and it's barely more damage than upcasting Inflict Wounds with a 6th level slot anyways. So if you want an in-combat spell, Blade Barrier is your best bet. This is a ton of AoE damage and creates difficult terrain, so enemies have a harder time getting out of it. But generally speaking, I recommend that your cleric just spend their spell slots on these day-long buffs for your party, so if you have a refresh, just use both of these. And finally, at character level 12, we get our third feat, and the feat that we're going to take is of course an ability score improvement to max out our wisdom. This makes us the most effective possible spellcaster, so is almost always going to be the most impactful option. If you're using Ethel's Hair for this character to boost your wisdom for 20, I generally think that other party members will probably want it more because this character is so self-sufficient, but if you don't have anyone else who wants it more and want to use it on this character, then there are some other feats worth considering. Similarly, if you are using a mod that gives you additional feats, like the Feats at Even Levels mod, then there's some other feats that are very much worth considering. Lucky can make the character significantly more consistent, and we're already extremely consistent and reliable, so this is a great way to remove even more randomness from the game. Warcaster can help maintain concentration on your spells, especially if you're finding that you are dropping concentration on Spirit Guardians a lot, then this can be a great way to fix that issue. So if you find that happening a lot in combats, then Warcaster is very much worth considering. But in general, the best way to construct this character is going to be with Alert and 2 ASIs to boost our wisdom up to 20. Alright, my friends, that is our Death Cleric, but of course we can make the character more powerful using items, so let's talk about those. 4 items for this character. One of the great things about clerics is that they get access to some of the most powerful combinations of items in the entire game, and Death Clerics not only get all of these, but add another extremely powerful item set to the equation when you get to the late game. So firstly, in the early game, you're going to want the Buff on Heal item set. This is a very powerful set of items that makes all of your healing significantly better by buffing your allies. So the Hellrider's Pride and the Whispering Promise add Bless and Blade Ward to an ally every time you heal them, which means that they will be both taking much less damage and being much more efficient and reliable in combat. And then you can add the Boots of Aid and Comfort to that to make all your healing even more effective by giving 3 temp HP every time you heal. You can trigger this not only with the spells that we took, like Healing Word and Mass Healing Word, but also by throwing a potion at an ally, so it's a great way to heal, to buff your entire party. In addition to that, we are going to, in the later game, we have access to the Radiating Orb item set and the Reverberation item set. The Luminous Armor plus the Coruscation Ring and the Callous Glow Ring mean that our radiant damage that we apply through spells and through Spirit Guardians are going to stack Radiating Orb on enemies. Radiating Orb reduces enemy attack rolls by 1 for each stack, up to 10 stacks, meaning that enemies who stand in our Spirit Guardians will just not be able to hit their attacks. In addition to that, we can add the Boots of Stormy Clamor and the Gloves of Belligerent Skies to stack Reverberation on those enemies, which not only deals damage and knocks them prone, which is excellent, it also reduces their Constitution saves, which is especially good for Death Domain Clerics because we have a bunch of spells like Blindness that target enemy Constitution saves, so this gives us the ability to land those spells much more reliably. So this item set will be kind of your late game setup, and this item set will be kind of your early game setup, though you can transition between these two depending on what your party needs. In addition to those extremely powerful sets of specific items, you're also going to want anything that increases your spell save DC. This character, of course, wants to cast spells at enemies and not have them succeed on their saving throws, so items like the Fistbreaker Helm that give you an increase to your spell save DC, items like Cleric's Shield that give you an increase to your spell save DC are at a premium for this character, because of course you want your spells to land more reliably. Bonuses to your initiative, like from the Fistbreaker Helm or the Sentinel Shield, are also very good, especially if you didn't take Alert at level 4, then you're definitely going to want some initiative items in order to improve the character. For our weapon, there's a lot of different options, and we'll change what our weapon set is depending on at various points during the game. So firstly, this character makes an excellent carrier for Falara Louv. Now, you won't be melee attacking with this, but you will often be up in melee, so Falara Louv can be used for the Shriek ability in order to deal additional damage. It synergizes extremely well with Spirit Guardians. You do not have to have weapon proficiency with it, although you do, in order to use this effect. So Falara Louv just increases the amount of damage that you do vastly by activating Shriek to make every damage instance deal an extra d4 of thunder damage, and this includes on damage from your allies as well. An alternative option is the Staff of Arcane Blessing. This lets you cast Bless, but an improved version of Bless, which gives you the normal effects of Bless, but instead of adding a d4 to your spell attack rolls, you add 2d4 to your spell attack rolls. The tooltip here is a little bit misleading because it says an additional d4 to everything and then 2d4. What it means is instead of the normal plus 1d4, you get plus 1d4, plus 1d4, and plus 2d4. However, all of the attacks that we're making are spell attack rolls. Inflict Wounds is a spell attack roll, so it benefits from the doubled bless of Staff of Arcane Blessing. As does Bone Chill, which is also a spell attack roll, so that will make our character extremely reliable at hitting those spell attacks. If we have like a Warlock in our party as well, or a Wizard using Ray of Frost, then the Staff of Arcane Blessing is a huge early game power-up. In the middle and late game, we may want to swap this out. The Devotee's Mace gives us the Healing Incense Aura, which is excellent with the buff on heal item set, so if we're using that, then the Devotee's Mace is a great weapon slot, and Marka Heshkir is best in slot for any caster. Being able to cast multiple 6th-level spell slots in a day is great, and with Koreska's Favor, it will give you the ability to cast Chain Lightning once per short rest, increasing the damage output of this character immensely. However, Death Domain Clerics also get access to a different weapon that's even better, I think, for this specific character, and that's the Staff of Cherished Necromancy. How this works is when you kill a hostile creature with a spell, you gain life essence, and while you have life essence, you can cast a necromancy spell without consuming a spell slot. This can let you cast a 6th level Inflict Wounds or a 6th level Blight without spending a spell slot at all for a huge amount of burst damage. And while you can't recharge it with the free spell, this just gives you a tremendous amount of additional damage over the course of the day by casting all of these free spells. Lets you use your highest level spell slots much, much more frequently, so the Staff of Cherished Necromancy is great. Another option also is to take the Dual Wielder feat and use both Marka Heshkir and the Staff of Cherished Necromancy at the same time. Finally, a couple other items to fill things out. The Vivacious Cloak gives you 8 temp HP when you cast a spell in melee, which we're going to be doing quite frequently. So this is a nice option for this character, or any other defensive cloak is quite good. This Elemental Absorption Cloak that we have equipped is also pretty good, just preventing elemental burst damage from taking the character out. We have reasonable armor class once we've equipped all of our armor and shields and reducing enemy attacks with voluminous armor and everything, but we do have relatively low hit points, so can still die to AoE damage like from a fireball. The Elemental Absorption Cloak does help with that. Another important tool for us to have is Misty Step. So if we're not a Githyanki especially, we're going to want a pair of boots like the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, which are very good for this character because they also mean you can't slip and fall on ice, which will cause you to lose concentration on your spells. And getting a short rest Misty Step is a tremendous bonus to your character because it gives you a panic button for when you're out of position or lets you reach enemies that you otherwise wouldn't be able to reach. elixirs of giant strength we already discussed as well, so you can use those to make melee weapon attacks if you want to. But the big thing is going to be having these weapon sets. For my final suggestion for this character, I would recommend the Staff of Terrorist Necromancy, the Radiating Orb item set, so we're going to end up with these items, Gloves of Belligerent Skies, and so on. And then we will also take the Fistbreaker Helm and Ketheric's Shield, and round it out with the Vivacious Cloak. And then for our weapon, I already mentioned that we're using the staff in order to multicast our spells. So this will be kind of our endgame setup. It does look a little silly, which is why we didn't use it from the beginning, but it's a very, very powerful setup. All right, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at the Death Domain Cleric. And of course, if you have, feel free to leave a comment and hit the like button. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm, so I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 build guides and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.